Ron Paul kept mentioning this figure of $1 trillion a year to maintain the empire. And to arrive at that figure, you can Google Robert Higgs and $1 trillion defense budget and that sort of thing, and you'll see an article laying it all out. But you don't just add up the Department of Defense budget. You think they're going to be that straightforward about it? Of course not. They've got basically aspects of defense in the Department of Energy and other departments and Homeland Security. I mean, what is Homeland Security, after all, if not defense, presumably, right? Makes you wonder, what's the Department of Defense been doing all these years if we need a whole new agency to defend the country, right? I mean, what kind of an interesting thought. But you add to this, so all these other departments, you add in the share of interest on the national debt that's attributable to military measures, you add in all the supplementals. Basically what you need to do, a good rule of thumb according to Dr. Higgs, is take the Pentagon budget and double it. And that's about what you're really spending. But then consider the hidden costs. Ever since the end of World War II, it's fluctuated somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of all our research and development talent has been siphoned off into the military sector, even at a time when the U.S. government had command of 6 tons of TNT per person on Earth. Now, presumably with that, you could kill the person many times if he came back as a zombie. But otherwise, presumably, this would be too much, okay? I mean, this is obviously some profiteering going on. This would be a little bit too much. And again, if you look at the revolving doors of Pentagon consultants and defense firm executives, and and the media, and they just revolve, and they all do very, very well. And there is nothing free market or conservative about any of that. It's all a disaster. Think about where a lot of this research talent might have gone if it hadn't been spent on a lot of these sometimes extremely harebrained projects. Or think about the consequences for the private sector when the Pentagon becomes your major client. So take, for example, the once robust American machine tool industry. It was the envy of the world up through the 1960s. Then the Pentagon became the major customer of the American machine tool industry, and we began to see a decline, a major decline, in favor of, instead, European and Japanese machine tool manufacture. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons is, when the Pentagon is your major customer, you no longer really have to worry about cost minimization. The Pentagon will come up with the money one way or another. That is not the primary concern. The primary concern is, can you deal with the fact that we're going to be changing our requests every 3 hours? Can you deal with the various unusual requests we might make? Do you interact well with the military community? Cost is way down here. They'll get the money somehow. So this perverts the way the private sector normally functions, such that instead of being cost-minimizing firms, these firms become cost and subsidy maximizing firms, so that when they try to go back into the private sector, they don't even know how to do it anymore. So for example, in the machine tool industry, the big thing by the end of the 60s was something called numerical control machine tool technology. Well, Americans started to develop numerical control machine tool technology, but they developed it in such a way that it was so expensive, the only people who could afford it were the Pentagon. Nobody else could afford it. Whereas the Japanese and the Europeans, they produced affordable numerical control machine tool technology, because they're not operating under these perverse consequences. Or I love when a lot of times these defense firms have turned to try to produce mass transit systems. Oh, that's been a super, super thing. Grumman, for example, produced buses for New York City that broke down so often New York City had to sue them. Now, when something is so bad in New York City that even the New York City government thinks it's bad, it's bad. But there are other examples as well that we could go on along these lines. It is incredibly, incredibly wasteful beyond any stretch of our imagination. And yet, it's to hold up an empire that is counterproductive, not in terms of the people who make careers running the empire, but in terms of the interests and the welfare and the wealth of the American people. It is counterproductive in every way. So we're not like we're blowing the money, but at least they're keeping us safe. We're blowing the money, and it's making us worse off by stirring up hornets' nests all over the world. Now again, I realize that if you've spent your whole life just listening to Mitt Romney speeches, this will seem like heresy. However, Mitt Romney is a plastic man who has no brain. what somebody like bin Laden wants to do is precisely to lure the United States deep into the Middle East so as to drain it, as they tried to do with the Soviet Union. It wound up successful. They just want to drain the U.S. so as to get the U.S. out of the Middle East so they can carry on with what their interests are. But that is the plan. That is the plan, and of course, the alleged patriots in our country are falling right into that plan. Oh yeah, well we'll fight them here and we'll fight them there. And meanwhile, the wars go on and on and on. They drain the country, and bin Laden says, well, this is pretty much what helps recruitment over here. Because if, I know we get told a lot, and I've read all the stuff about Islam everybody else has read, but I know we get told a lot that, they're going to hate us no matter what we do, and so, because we're wearing blue jeans, and we drink beer, and we have barbecues, and we march against breast cancer, and they hate all these things, right? And so no matter what we do, they're just going to want to come kill us. Well, okay, the Ayatollah tried doing that in the early to mid-'80s, tried rallying the Islamic world against the U.S. on the grounds that we had freedom of speech and women wearing short pants or being in the workplace and so on. We got to go after these people. And the response was, again, crickets. Like, you got no response to this whatsoever. When bin Laden comes along in the mid-'90s and says, all right, I'll tell you what the grievances are. I don't care about the stupid blue jeans, for goodness sake. I mean, I have a finite number of things I can expect to accomplish in the world, and getting blue jeans off people in the West is not really on the list. But what I would like to do is get infidel troops off the Arabian Peninsula. I'd like to get these sanctions lifted off Iraq. And he's got this long list of things that involve interventions in the Islamic world. And that is what brings about recruitment. When you talk about blue jeans and freedom of speech, nothing happens. So the question becomes, is this good or is this bad? You're not supposed to ask this question, folks, but that's what Ron Paul does for a living. He asks questions that nobody wants him to ask, and that they exclude him for asking. And I'll point out, by the way, with regard to Afghanistan, that now that George Will has even said, maybe this Afghanistan thing is a hopeless cause, trying to impose a democracy in this country, in a country that has never allowed any occupying power to make any progress whatsoever. Maybe this is not that smart a thing to do. It's just going to go on forever. And then Tony Blankley is now publicly hinting and privately coming right out and saying, oh, we got to get the heck out of here. I think it's now safe politically for people to come out and say, I think we got to just get out of there. When George Will and Blankley say this. Blankley's with the Washington Times. He had a book earlier this year calling for the reintroduction of the military draft, the peacetime draft, that people should be drafted in peacetime. So when he says it's time to get out of Afghanistan, again, I think it's safe. You don't have to worry about, gee, should I run a poll about this? I think it's safe to start talking about it.